So, photo one, we got a lot of information to cover. This will be one of those Zooms where it takes a little bit longer than some of our other Zooms. And that's because today we're going to cover shutter speed and ISO. So on our last one, we covered aperture, right? And there are three parts to the exposure triangle, and that was aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So today we're going to cover those other two parts. And before I jump into that, I'll recap what week one held, module one. All right, so quick recap of week one, and pretty much what you needed to do was turn in the syllabus, which is this assignment here that I've highlighted. Take that pre-survey. Pre-survey has no effect on your grade at all. So, if you get a 0 out of 20 on it, that's okay. If you get a 20 out of 20, that's also okay. Then we talked about what to do with lexicon. This first week had a lot, but we're going to create a long running list of all of those words. Download the app Lightroom, right? So if you haven't gotten Lightroom yet, you need that. And there was a getting to know you discussion where you replied to a few prompts and then replied to at least one classmate. So that was all week one held. So module two, or week two. This is what we covered, right? The aperture priority. And from our Zoom session in announcements, I think, yep. In announcements under dSLR mode dial aperture priority mode, right? I took our Zoom and cut out all of the extra bits. So it's just what, the information that's needed. And so that is here in our announcements if you need to go over that again. And of course you could ask me questions. And so this is where we are now. We also took our lexicon, copied it, pasted it into a notes page. So I'm going to share that. Photo one, there it is. So up to this point, the minimum for our vocabulary, which is right, that's what lexicon means, vocabulary, the words that are associated with photography that we need to learn. From week one, we copied and pasted that list into here. And week two, we had 7 more words that we added. So under week two, copied and pasted all of these into there. The reason we do that is so that you can search inside of your notes to find where it talks about JPEG, right? So if you come across a question during our course in a quiz, you can open your notes, search for what you're looking for, and find that definition right here. Okay, cool. So we are here, shutter priority mode. We're going to cover this page and the next page, and you'll highlight it. There we go. You'll have all the information you need to complete the discussion at that point. And then there's the check on learning, which I'll talk about after I cover these 2 pages here. So here we are, shutter priority mode. And we talked about system cameras, and if you can see my video feed, I have a DSLR camera here, and this is designed to teach you how to use one of these. And so these are the ones where you can change out lenses. You can change out battery packs on the bottom, right? It has this whole system of components. Operate, right, that come apart. So you can build these out, and it gets pretty crazy. We learn how to operate one of these because this is a dual credit course. And in order to get that credit, I have to be able to say you have learned how to use one, even though we don't get to have our hands on one, right? So I teach it as if we're going to, and then we'll go into how to translate all this to the iPad. So this time the mode dial, right, the top of that DSLR camera looks like this, and there's a dial that you can turn. Now we're talking about as if we had set it to this, S or TV, which means shutter priority, S or TV. Canon cameras, the brand Canon, will have TV, which means time value, but really it's shutter priority mode. Last time we talked AV, A or AV, which was aperture priority. So now we're covering shutter priority. And we're also going to cover manual today, M for manual. So any questions about what the abbreviations on the mode dial mean? All right, doesn't look like it. So if the A or AV meant aperture priority mode, and you controlled the aperture while the camera controlled the shutter speed and the ISO, then this time when we talk about shutter priority, who's got a good guess as to what the camera controls when you're in shutter priority and what you control?
You control the shutter and the camera controls the aperture and ISO.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. So what is a shutter? Well, it's kind of like if the aperture is like your eye, your pupils, right? And when it's bigger, it lets more light in. When it's smaller, it keeps light out, the technical side. The shutter would be kind of like your eyelids, but for a camera, it's always closed. And then they're only open, you know, for a little bit of time. So the shutter would be like an eyelid, and it exposes that sensor to light. And if it's open for a long time, it collects more light. And if it's open for a very small amount of time, then it collects very little light. And it shows up on the back of a camera as a fraction of a second. So it might show up on the back of your camera on the screen as 1/30 or 1/4000 or 1/500. And it can have these little quotation marks. These quotation marks mean seconds, right? So your shutter could be open for 1 second, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, and even more, just depends. But then it's open for a really long time. So it's going to get a lot of light versus when it's open really short amount of time. So a fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, it opens and closes so fast that hardly any light comes in. And so that's the technical piece, right? Just like aperture had a technical and a creative use, shutter does as well. That technical is always controlling light. So the shutter has the technical piece of controlling light. And now we control what's called motion blur. And aperture, remember, controlled the background blur, the depth of field, how deep or shallow it is. More open aperture gave you a lot more blur. Well, the longer your shutter is open, the more motion blur you're gonna have. So if you have a long shutter speed, a slow shutter speed, or a long exposure, and something passes in front of your shutter, like this bicycle here, that bicycle is going to be blurry. Whereas if you have it open and closed really quickly, that bicycle will appear to be frozen in time. And that's kind of the gist of it. Let's look at a shutter. Okay, so this right here that you can see in this video, should I go full screen and annotate? Okay. So this is the sensor right there. That is what is collecting light, right? So, oh, somebody's joining. This is the sensor, it's collecting light. I'm gonna give you some information that you don't need to remember, but a camera sensor is covered in these little microscopic cavities called photosites. And light is made up of what is called photons, right? So these photons or particles of light leave a light source like this light that I have shining on me, or the sun, right? Any sort of light source, that light, those photons leave it. They bounce off of objects and go into our eye. For a camera, of course, the light leaves the light source, bounces off an object, and goes into the lens, gets focused down to the sensor here. And the photosites collect them, and they all over this sensor here are photosites. So, to keep the sensor safe, there is a shutter that's going to open and close. You'll see it opening and closing right now, basically. And you can control how long it is open. Right, so it's going to block light, let light in, block light, let light in, block light, just like an eyelid blinking. Same idea. Okay, so there was a shutter opening and closing. And again, if we let that be open for a long time, like 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, we're going to get a lot of light. It'll be brighter with more motion blur. If we open and close it really, really fast, like 1/1000th of a second or 2,000th or 3 or 4 up to 8, then it's going to be a darker exposure because not much light is allowed to get to the sensor. And it's going to freeze everything. There'll be no motion blur. Okay, let's look at 2 photos, examples. So we have this first image of a waterfall. If you've ever seen pictures of like at night where there's like a highway and it's just streaks of light where the cars were driving by, somebody has taken a photo with a longer exposure or a slower shutter speed, or waterfalls where the water looks very silky or velvety, right? So this could have been maybe a 2-second long exposure, right? The quotation mark means seconds. So the shutter opened for 2 seconds and then closed. And all the water that was moving, all that motion was captured in the picture because it just kept on moving even while the shutter was open. And so the water appears blurry. And then if you raise that shutter speed, and we'll look at this image instead, to maybe 1/250th of a second, right? So this is faster, a shorter exposure time, a faster shutter speed. This water appears to just be frozen. It went over the edge and just stopped. And that's sort of the effect that you can, right, creatively use motion blur for. And before I show a live example on my camera again, like we did with Aperture, are there any questions about that shutter speed, controlling light on the technical and controlling blur on the creative side?
Yeah, how on the camera do you change it? Is that what you're about to show?
Well, I'm gonna change it. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, and on my video here, I'm going to change my shutter speed. And with video, there are some specifics, right? In video, for things to appear normal, like usual motion blur, the way things would normally look in the world, we have to be at a shutter speed that is double the amount of frames per second. So any of you taking video right now, this might be helpful. So, and those of you that are like, it's just photography, this is some extra knowledge, but it's not going to be on a test, what I'm about to tell you, okay? Video is typically shot at 24 frames per second for cinema, for film. 24 pictures every second will display. And due to a thing called persistence of vision, it starts to look like it's moving. At 12 seconds, it'll start actually, but at 24, it looks like what we're used to seeing the world in. So for a camera to record at that frame rate, the frame rate of 24 frames per second, we have to have a shutter speed, that shutter opening and closing, blocking it, right? Block, opening and closing. That's double the frame rate. So I'm shooting at a frame rate of 24 frames per second. So my shutter speed is at 1/50, 1/50th of a second right now. And if I leave that, it's gonna look weird, but it's gonna give the proper effect. So if any of you are really into video and you wanna shoot like super slow-mo and you wanna shoot like 240 frames per second, then your shutter speed is gonna have to be at about 500, 1/500, right? Your shutter speed should always be double your frame rate. extra knowledge. So I'm going to change my shutter speed right now on my video. Right now it is at 1/50. I'm going to make it a faster. First, I'm going to go to a faster shutter speed. Maybe I'll go all the way up to like 1/ I don't know. We'll go to 1/1000th of a second. What do you think is going to happen? First, technically, and second, creatively. Technical being light, creative being motion blur for a shutter. Who's got a good guess?
The sensor is going to be exposed to light for a lesser amount of time.
Yep. So it's going to make the image appear darker or brighter.
Darker.
Absolutely. And then what do you think is going to happen with motion blur? When I wave my hand,
It's gonna give it a sense of movement.
Yep.
Sí, aquí yo no prendo el giro en la casa a menos que esté bien.
Thank you, Joel. All right, I was going to do it for you, but you got it. All right, so here we go. I'm at 1/50th of a second, 1/25th, 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, and let's go to 1/1250, 1/1250. So right now on my camera, my shutter speed is 1/1250. That's my shutter speed currently. And you can see it definitely got darker. So what is something that you've already learned about that I could do to bring in more light without changing my shutter speed?
You can open up the aperture more.
Exactly, open up the aperture more. However, I have my aperture as open as it can be. It's as open, I can't open it anymore. So there are 3 parts to the exposure triangle.
ISO.
Yeah, exactly. The third part we haven't really talked about is that ISO. And my ISO is at 100. So ISO controls the sensitivity of the sensor to light, right? So a smaller number means less sensitive, and so it's darker. If I make my ISO a higher number, it'll be more sensitive, so it'll get brighter. The problem with ISO is when you make your sensor really sensitive to light, it introduces noise. It starts to get noisy. And so I'm going to make my ISO go up because that's my only part of the exposure triangle that's left. But if I were to take a photo, it would be too noisy for me to use. You're not going to see the noise so much in this video right now. But so my shutter speed was 1/1250. My aperture is 1.f1.8. And right now my ISO is 100. I'm going to change my ISO right now. So right now I'm at 100, 200, 400, 800, 1,600, 3,200. Let's see if it'll focus. Anytime now, camera. There we go. And that looks to be about the same. And with this particular camera, this ISO is okay. Let's see what happens when I wave my hand versus where it was before. It's definitely weird looking.
There's no motion blur.
Yeah, motion blur is gone. Those of you who like gaming, this is what we're striving for, right? We want a high performance gaming experience, so that way we can prep.
I always turn it off. I hate motion blur in games.
Yeah, that's usually what we do. We go in the settings, turn off world motion blur, any movement, right? Because we want it to be crisp. And so that's what happens. So shutter speed, bigger number, got darker. And I had to use the other parts of my exposure triangle, but my aperture was already wide open. So I was stuck raising my ISO, which worked, right? So now my ISO is 3,200. Cool. All right, I'm gonna leave aperture where it's at. I'm gonna leave my F number, my aperture where it's at. I'm gonna leave my ISO where it's at. I'm gonna take my shutter speed to like, I don't know, 1 second. 1 second. What's gonna happen on the technical side and the creative side?
bright.
Bright, for sure. And what about blur? What do you think it'll look like?
It'd be more blurry.
Very blurry.
Blurry. Yeah,
Just letting in more light.
and
Digo, toma tiempo.
totally. So here we go. So I'm going to 1/1000th, 1/500th, 2/50th, 1/125th, 60th, 30th. Okay, it won't. I can only go to 1/8 of a second. So now my shutter speed is 1/8. There we go. All right. Clearly it's too bright. But shutter,
You
I
have
have
ascended.
I have ascended. I'm in Stargate. I have two other parts of the exposure triangle though, right? We have that aperture and ISO. What can I do to bring the exposure back to where we can see things?
Turn down the ISO.
Turn down my ISO, absolutely. And what else is available to me?
The shutter speed.
Well, but if let's say I wanted to leave my shutter speed where it's at for whatever reason. There's three parts. Aperture, yep. What would I do to it?
Close it.
Close it. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to do that first, even though in an ideal world we would keep ISO as low as possible. So, whoa, there it is.
Too much motion blur.
Yeah. So my aperture is at an f22, which is blocking light out. And we can see the background is in focus and I'm in focus. And I appear to be out of sync with my voice almost. So I think I'll go ahead and, because I want to be isolated from the background, I'll go ahead and put my aperture back down to an f1.8. And I'm going to take Gage's first piece of advice, because that is always the right answer. And that is to turn down the ISO. Turn down ISO. There we go. Okay, so now my ISO is at 100, but I'm still overexposed. So now I'll start closing my aperture. F1.8, F2, 2.8, F4. F4.5 is probably good enough. So that way I keep a little bit of background blur, but when I wave my hand, it's like, it's almost not even there. Because the shutter is opening and closing so slowly that everything that's moving is blurry. So, well, let me fix this. So I'm going to put my shutter speed back to 1/50. My aperture back to an f1.8. And let's do ISO of 125. There we go. And now things are back to being fairly normal looking as far as motion blur goes. My background's nice and blurry. And that is, I mean, that's shutter speed and ISO. This is manual. We have learned how to use a camera in manual mode. So because I'm locked in at having to be at a 1/50, that leaves me the two other parts to control my exposure, aperture and ISO. At the end of each lesson, you're going to find a red check mark and it's going to say self-reflection. We're going to highlight and copy all of these questions. And if you read this underlined, italicized, and bolded part, it says some or all of the questions below may appear on any quiz, check on learning, or your final exam. They will, some of these will, and they'll be word for word the same. So the reason we highlight, copy, and paste into our notes is so that we can, when we take the quiz, we can use these notes and we can search within them. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to share my notes. I'm going to make sure I'm on my photo one reflections note. And that was mod 2 aperture priority was what we did before. And what we're looking at now is this here, mod 2 shutter priority, right? Shutter speed priority mode. So I'm going to paste in all those questions here. Yeah, let's answer that. Do you want me to paste in the next set, or do you want me to answer these and then do the next set? Whoever chimes in first gets it the way they would like it. Because the next one,
Set first.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Paste in the next set first.
You got it. The next set's going to be mod 2 manual. Right, so on this page, the shutter priority page, I'm going to click next. And we're going to look at a little bit of this. We'll look at a little bit of this, but not much. Like, we're going to breeze right through it. But we still need to get these questions and answer them. That way you've got all of the information. So I'm going to highlight those. Right, I'm on the manual page. dSLR mode dial manual mode. I'm going to highlight the self-reflection questions. Copy them. And I'm going to paste them into these notes. And we're going to answer these questions. So which shutter speed will allow more light, the technical side of things, to reach the camera sensor? 1/8 of a second or 1/1000th of a second? So which one is a longer amount of time? And it's hard when we're talking fractions.
1/8.
Yes. 1/8. That shutter speed between those two options is going to allow more light to reach the camera sensor. Which, right, so if that one's true, then the opposite is probably true. Which shutter speed will keep light from reaching the sensor? 1/8 or 1/1000?
1/1000.
Got it. Yep, it opens and closes so fast that hardly any light is able to reach the sensor. Which shutter speed, so that would cover the technical, now we're looking at creative. Which shutter speed will allow motion to blur? So of these two, which one's going to give you more motion blur?
1/8.
1/8, yep, and Kaya, in the messages, you got it, exactly, 1/8. That's going to give you a lot more motion blur because it's open for so long. Anything moving around shows up as blurry until the shutter closes. All right, then which of these shutter speeds will best freeze motion?
1000.
Exactly. So, you're doing sports photography or wildlife, you're probably going to want to be at a faster shutter speed. That way the action that you're trying to capture is frozen. What does TV or S, right? It might sometimes, what does S or TV on a mode dial stand for?
Shutter priority.
Mhm, exactly. Shutter priority. And Canon, being silly, even though they're my favorite camera maker for the most part, for photos for sure, is time value, but shutter priority is the answer. Shutter priority. What does a quotation mark, what does that quotation mark mean regarding shutter speed?
Seconds.
Seconds, yep. So now we're not shooting in fractions of a second, but we're shooting in whole seconds. Right, so if you see a number that's, 10 with a quotation, your shutter is going to be open for 10 full seconds. And that's how you do things like make the waterfall appear all velvety, or get, if you go out to the corner of the street, put a camera on a tripod and let those lights, cars drive by, they'll show up as streaks of light rather than being frozen. So how can we prevent camera shake? And
Higher shutter speed.
yep, that's one of them. Faster shutter speed. What else?
Tripod.
tripod. And there's also a thing called a remote, right? So you release the shutter without pressing the button on the camera, but instead you press a button over here. There are apps that'll do it now as well. But faster shutter and tripod, that's the way to go. Especially if you're going to do something like that where you want, car lights to show up as a streak in the photo, you're gonna have to set that camera down. If you don't have a tripod, you can always use the timer that cameras have, so that when you press the button, you have 10 seconds before it takes the exposure. So you set the camera somewhere steady, press the button, and now your hands are off of it. 10 seconds later, the shutter opens for whatever amount of time you set it to, then it closes, and then you can pick it up and handle it again. I used to have to do that when I couldn't afford a nice tripod or anything. There's lots of ways to get around that. What is a measurement of the time the shutter is open, shown in seconds or fractions of a second, called? And also, where can we find that? That's in our lexicon, right? And just a measurement.
An f-stop.
A measurement of the time the shutter is open, shown in seconds or fractions of a second. So the f-stop is the measurement of the aperture, and we're talking about the shutter.
Shutter speed.
Yeah. And I did the search in here just because I want you to see how that works, right? Let's say you got to that question, you went over your notes, you typed measurement, clicked on the lexicon, and the first one here, shutter speed. Well, I took away the highlight there, but right, measurement. Shutter speed, a measurement of the time the shutter is open, shown in seconds or fractions of a second. So there we go. And we go to reflections, and that is the answer, shutter speed. And over time, you will have a lot of these, you'll remember a lot of them, but I want you to be able to find the answers in one place without going to Google. What are the three parts of the exposure triangle?
Aperture, shutter speed, ISO.
Nailed it. Yep. Those are three parts of the exposure triangle. We balance all of those to get the photo to be what we want, whether that's background blur, motion blur, brighter, darker, grainy, right? There might be uses where creatively you decide, I'm gonna raise my ISO. I want it to have this grainy, grungy look. So we're gonna answer these questions here in a second, but I need to show you this page real fast. It's gonna be so fast. All right. Manual mode. M is manual, right? We've got that down. We already saw what ISO can do, right? A bigger ISO number is going to make the sensor more sensitive to light, and so it's a brighter image, right? So if you've exhausted all other efforts, you can use your ISO. But those other efforts should include opening the blinds, curtains, bringing in a light source, right? All of those things before you raise your ISO. However, you're clearly not going to add more light to this scene with the rainbow, right? You're not like the sun is lighting this, and you're not going to do much to make it brighter yourself. So this would be a time to use your ISO. The rule is to keep your ISO as low as possible. That's the rule. And if you can see, I wonder if I can zoom in. Yeah. There we go. This image was shot with an ISO of 200 on the left here. This image was shot with an ISO of 3200, and you can see how much noise is in the one on the right, the higher number. The difference is clear. The image at ISO 3200 has much more noise. The rule you should follow is to keep your ISO as low as possible in order to keep the quality high. High ISO, low quality. Low ISO, higher quality. This is really important when using small sensors like your mobile cameras, and it is best for you to add light with lamps, windows, flashlights, whatever. Okay, so let's go answer those questions. All right, out of these two ISO options, which ISO will make your camera sensor more sensitive to light, 100 or 6,400?
6,400.
Absolutely. A bigger number means more sensitivity, means a brighter image. And that means the opposite is true as well. So which ISO will make your camera sensor less sensitive to light? 100? Go ahead.
100.
Absolutely, right. Which ISO will make your images noisier or grainy?
6,400.
Yep. Which ISO will make your images less noisy?
100.
You'll see stuff in the chat there. Yeah, yep. Not sure when you answered that one, Kaya. I missed it. My chat window closes on me sometimes. Have to get better about checking that. But yep, 100. All right. What does M on the mode dial stand for?
Manual.
Yeah. Look at you're already professional photographers that know more about how a camera operates than many who are using cameras to make money today. What is our rule? This is our rule. This is not like a out in the photography world rule. And it was different when using film. But our rule for ISO, what is it?
Keep it as low as possible.
Put it as low as possible, unless you're doing it on purpose, right? Once you know the rules, you can start to break them intentionally. Intent, purpose. What is the definition of composition as it relates to photography? So this goes back to the week 1 lexicon. And if anybody's got it memorized, cool. Does anyone want me to do the whole search thing inside of the notes? Or are you doing that on your own now? This is my favorite definition in all of photography.
The intentional arrangement of elements within a scene in a way that suits the core idea or goal of your work best.
Yes. So it is intentional elements. Oh boy, within a scene that, what is it exactly? I always just hang on to the first part. But basically it suits the goal of the work. All right, I'll have to search. Elements within a scene in a way that suits the core idea or goal of your work best. Core idea. Okay, so that is the definition of composition. There are rules of composition, and that's what the whole last half, like the last 6 weeks, becomes about, is composition. So we take all of our knowledge here on how to use a camera, operate it to create exposures, make sure we get that down, and then we start adding in rules of composition. And this is when your photography is going to change for a lot of you. You're like, whoa, wait a minute. Look, I really know what I'm doing. And it is, the intentional arrangement. It's totally on purpose, right? You control every bit of it. I composed this Canvas course that you're taking. I intentionally arranged it, right? And put elements in it on purpose. It's a fun definition for me. So what term is defined as the distance between the nearest and furthest elements in a scene that appear to be acceptably sharp in an image? We're going to take photos that deal with this intentionally pretty soon, but what we're talking about is the distance between okay, not in focus, and now it's in focus, and in focus, and now not in focus.
Isn't it the depth of field?
Nailed it. Depth of field. And that can be shallow or deep. Which aperture value, 1.8 or f22, will give us a shallow depth of field? Shallow. Just throwing it out there. Which one gives us the shallow depth of field? An aperture of f1.8 or f22?
1.8.
1.8. Yep, smaller f number, shallower, narrow slice of area that's in focus. Absolutely. What are the three parts of the exposure triangle?
Aperture, ISO, and shutter speed.
Yep, so that one showed up on all three of the reflections. It's almost like guarantee that's going to be on the quiz. So trimester 2, module 2, aperture priority page. We got those ones done. We got module 2 manual, and we got module 2 shutter priority. I think I'm going to these together. And sometimes it helps to put like something up here. You can use plus signs, whatever's going to help it stand out to you. You can use a bunch of asterisks. Yeah, whatever's going to help you see the separation between it all, if you want. Of course, you don't have to. But I like to do that. All right, so whenever we have a lesson that has self-reflections again, we're just going to add that here. I mean, it's probably going to be a mod 3 thing, right? Who knows? But we're going to find out. So that is it for all of those questions. Now, when you take the exam, you literally have every question and answer that could possibly show up on the mod 1 and 2 check on learning. Okay, so you are ready to take that quiz right now, but you have until January 4th. I'm super excited for all of you, because really, I'm not just saying it, like there are professional photographers who don't know that much about how to operate a DSLR camera. And you now could, even though you don't have them, right? But you could pick up a DSLR like this, and once you understand what button is where, you could make all those settings be what you need them to be. And so many of them now have touch screens that you don't even need to know what dial to roll. In fact, none of my DSLRs, yeah, every one of them is a touch screen. So we now understand all those priority modes, but you could shoot in manual now, right? Manual. And notice I have a green yes. Yes, this is what you want to shoot in. That way the photo is exactly what you want it to be. You're intentionally arranging it. This diagram here, I'm not sharing my screen. Hang on. This diagram cracks me up. It's the best thing ever. Right here. This one. The diagram below sums up everything you have learned in the last 3 lessons in one infographic. It sums up like this, almost this entire photography class. So see if you can decipher or make sense of it. And I will provide a little bit of assistance in doing so. So right here, from here to here is one thing. I'm terrible at this. There's another thing. And then just that space is another. This is aperture. This is ISO. All right, so who wants to tell us what's what? What does this mean? This whole little diagram. And I saw in the survey that some students felt like teachers should just pick someone instead of.
Could I try?
Yeah.
Aperture is the focus point of the picture. Shutter is how much movement is in the picture, and the ISO is how much light you let in.
So those are all very good statements. And rather than how much light you let in, it's how sensitive the sensor is to light. Right?
All right.
And this diagram, right, we can see in the background here, it's really blurry. And it's showing us that the aperture at an f1.4 is really, really open. This side here though, right, and as the diaphragm of the aperture closes, right, the f-stop, at an f32, the person and the background is in focus. And then at a half of a second shutter speed, the object moving is blurry. At 1/1000th, not blurry. And then at a higher ISO, grainy versus lower, but it doesn't have the numbers there, which I find interesting. This does not show anything at technical side though.
Why is this?
Oh, I know. It's absolutely okay. Yeah. So this is a fun diagram. It just doesn't talk about the technical side. So unfortunately, I've stopped using it as much. I used to use it a lot in the classroom. It was like taped up everywhere. And then I was like, you know what? Students don't seem to really be getting the whole technical light aspect. But this is my diagram of the exposure triangle. And it should make sense to a lot of you more so now than it did before, right? So when we talk about aperture and we talk about a shallower depth of field, right? A wide open aperture, f1.4, we know that means that the background is blurred and there's more light, it's brighter, right? So all the blue writing applies to aperture, the green writing applies to shutter speed, and then the whole bottom is ISO. And this is your best ISO setting, the lowest one that's showing. And so a landscape photo, typically, right? This is typical. This is not always, it's not always the rule, but in general, a landscape photo, you might want to be at an aperture that's above an f8, because in a landscape, you want the person to see everything that's in that view, right? So you don't want lots of blur in it. You want the whole thing to be in view. And so you want there to be background is not blurred. So landscape at an f8, and you want to let it be open for a long time because you're closing the aperture, keeping light out. You might have to be at a slower shutter speed, but it's a landscape, right? So there isn't a whole lot of stuff moving around, right? If you open it for too long, the wind blowing trees could make those leaves a little blurry and stuff, but you'll be safe here. And so that's kind of what I've done is I've said portraits, you want to shoot, you know, between an aperture of 1.4 and 2.8, and then somewhere around here for shutter speed. Wildlife, you want a fast shutter speed and shallow depth of field, right? Because you want people to focus on that particular wildlife. Sometimes you want to show the context of the environment, right? So that wouldn't be true. But that's the exposure triangle, like explained in a different way. Peter McKinnon is my favorite photographer. When we did that getting to know you discussion, which some of you still need to do, and I'll make sure you know who needs to today, but that's my favorite photographer. There's a couple videos on camera basics by Peter McKinnon. if you're really into photography or you think you might enjoy it, when we actually get to the part where we're shooting photos and doing compositions and not just learning the technical piece of a shutter speed is, right? I understand that's not the funnest part. But photography really can be a good time. His videos are exceptional. We already answered those questions. So next, what's next is a discussion. Here's how to do it. Highlight all of this. Copy it. Notice I didn't neglect this last sentence. A lot of people, right, there's a tendency to do that. So make sure you get that last sentence, copy it, hit reply, paste that in there, and let's answer these questions. So you're going to answer in your own terms. Explain the exposure triangle. Explain it. Explain what's happening. Try to explain the relationships, the balancing of those three elements to achieve an exposure. What is A/AB on a camera mode dial? An acceptable answer can just be aperture priority mode. I get it, and that works. But if you can, talk a bit more about the aperture there. Unless you talk about it a lot up here, right? Like talking about the fact that a small f number is a wide open one that gives you more light and more blur or shallow depth of field, and then the opposite. What is S or TV on a camera mode dial? It's shutter priority mode. But of course, if you can expand upon that, feel free to do so. What is ISO? Well, that's the sensitivity of the sensor to light. But if you want to expand upon it and talk about lower ISO is higher quality, higher ISO is lower quality because you get grain and noise, the picture will start to turn into Swiss cheese, like holes all in it. Expand on it. And then, have you been doing flashcards, journaling the self-reflection questions? If not, why? What do you need to begin? And of course, I'm telling you that the minimum for this is to at least copy and paste all that stuff and answer it with me when I answer it in here. If you haven't been doing it, is there, like, what's the reason? Just, right, nobody's like, I'm not saying you have to do it or else you get a bad grade. I'm saying do it because it's really gonna help you. If you don't do it, that's on you. If you have, though, if you're doing it, do you see any help from it? We're at week 2, so you might not quite see it until you take this quiz, right? Then you'll be like, oh, wait a minute. I literally have all the answers. This is crazy. But by week 4, some of you are going to be like, I need to go back and get all of that stuff. But once you've answered those, you'll hit post reply. And some are already in here. Of course, feel free to reply to each other, discuss it with each other, talk about it. If you see someone's answer is not quite correct, you can let them know. Say, hey, you know, whoever you are, I think ISO is actually this, and you have this. Maybe it'll start a discussion. And then the last thing for this week was this check on learning. Check on learning. It's going to be made up of all those same questions that we just answered together. But I give guided notes, right? Because some of you, right, you have to have it. You need it. And I want to provide it because it's not about like, can you memorize all this stuff and then regurgitate it into a quiz? No, it's not about that. We're going to find out when you're taking photos. But if you go into announcements, and you go to the week 2 newsletter, there's a page of notes. We've talked about it before, but I'm just reminding you. And if you look at those reflection questions that we just answered and you look at this notes page, you'll see, well, these are all statements of the same thing, right? But the more you see it, the better. All right. So you still have to do the camera modes discussion and the quiz. Camera modes discussion is due by tomorrow. The quiz isn't due until the 4th of January, so you have the break if you want, but I don't think you'll need it. Totally up to you. What are your questions? How can I help you? Also, I'm wearing my holiday sweater. And the only red hat that I have. I can't find my Santa hat. I used to have one. I don't know where it went.